Now it's my pleasure to, I think I've already said some of the things, who I am, that I'm an alum of Penn. But thank you for joining us today for this Careers in the Energy Sector Alumni Panel. This event is presented as part of Energy Week, and everyone has their cool Energy Week t-shirts, or will get their cool Energy Week t-shirts. And it's really a full week of energy-focused events here on the Penn campus. So I hope you'll take advantage of the many wonderful programs that have been organized. You're going to hear from some of the highest flyers in the energy sector, leaders from the grid, energy markets, private equity, and transportation. And not only are these people accomplished, they are kind, and they've taken time out of their schedules to mentor Penn students. Why? Because I'm here speaking to students, the students in the audience. They once sat where you are sitting now. They know you are key to the world's energy transition. Probably the last 6 weeks has made that transition even more vivid than it was before. Some of you got to meet these alumni in our small group fireside chats earlier today. But I'm here principally not to introduce Willie Nelson, but to introduce our moderator, who will then introduce each of the panelists. Scott Kleinman is the co-president and lead partner at Apollo Global Management. For the past decade, he has focused Apollo's cyclical industrial business, including companies in the chemicals, forest products, and industrial sectors. In 2010, Scott was named lead partner for private equity. Prior to Apollo, he worked at Smith Barney in its investment banking division. He serves on the boards of directors of Momentive Performance Material and Verso Paper. Scott is a member of the Board of Advisors at the Wharton School of Design. He earned his BA and MS from Penn and Wharton, graduating magna cum laude, Phi Beta Kappa. And we have Scott to thank for the existence of the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy, which he founded in 2014. Without his vision and generosity, none of us would be gathered in this wonderful room today. Scott, over to you.
Thanks, Fritz, and thanks for everyone showing up today. I think we have an amazing, interesting panel to go through today. Before I introduce the panelists, I thought I would just give a little bit of context as to what Fritz alluded to, why we are sitting in this space today, why I helped set up the center eight years ago. Really, there were two primary goals, two primary focuses of the center. One was to bring primary energy policy research to campus here at Penn. The goal was, can we create good research, nonpartisan, non-biased research, and then get that research into the hands of relevant policy-making professionals. And then secondly, and perhaps more near and dear to my heart, was I wanted to raise the level of discourse around energy and energy policy on the Penn campus. If you think back to 8 years ago, and maybe some of you don't remember or weren't paying attention 8 years ago, but energy and energy policy was not a particularly sexy topic, back then. But coming from the work that I did, I had a growing sense that energy and energy policy was going to be very relevant. And I had an even stronger sense that young people wanted to start talking about it and cared about it. But it was very clear that the general public, let alone an Ivy League population, didn't have the vocabulary to talk about it, didn't really know what other than 30,000 feet, didn't really know what the drivers of energy policy and energy in general were. And so we wanted to set up something here on campus that would tie all the different, facets of energy together, would bring lots of events like this and speakers and other things to campus so that students can start getting more involved in energy and energy policy. And then ultimately, bringing dedicated professors to develop courses and coursework and ultimately, master's degrees and PhD degrees in energy policy. Because ultimately my goal, and maybe this is a big aspiration, was to have Penn be one of those places where students come to because they want to be some of the future leaders in energy policy, whether that's in government or NGOs or private corporations. And so, no pressure on this room. I'm sure you'll all do that. But that's the backdrop, and I think that sort of segues well into why we're here today. So maybe what I'll do is I'll introduce our panelists. I see sitting in the end chair we have Manu Asthana. Manu is a 20-year power and energy industry veteran and is currently president and CEO of PJM Interconnection, which is the largest power grid in North America. He has a BS in economics from Wharton, class of
95.
95. Great. Next on screen, we have Badr Khan. Badr is a 25-year veteran in the power and energy industry as well. He's currently president of National Grid US, leading the company's US business, providing electricity, natural gas, and clean energy solutions to more than 20 million customers in the Northeast. Badr has an MBA from Wharton, class of
99.
99. There you go. And lastly, but not leastly, we have Cherie Wilson. Cherie is MD of Government Affairs at Delta Airlines. Previously held a similar job at General Motors for many years. She lives at the intersection of corporations, NGOs, governments on a variety of key energy issues. I'm sure she'll have a lot to say on our discussion today. She has a BA in African Studies from Penn, class of... Oh.
Class of 2005, but Africana Studies minor.
Oh, there you go. Had it backwards. Sorry. 99, you said?
2005.
2005. Oh, sorry. So just to jump right in, right? The purpose of this panel is really to talk about career trajectories in the energy sector, lessons folks have learned, trends that they're observing in the space. I think you'll get a sense of the variety of jobs in the space. We were talking about this a little bit earlier. It's super varied, and where these sectors are going. And so, with that, maybe I will jump right into some questions. We'll save some time for Q&A. So think of your deep, insightful questions, or your not so deep, insightful questions, and we'll be sure to answer them. So first, I'll actually ask all three of you this question. What specific skills do you think have served you well in your industry, and how did you develop those skills? And so maybe, Badr, since you're on Zoom, we'll start with you.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Scott. Thanks for having me. And apologies I couldn't be there with everyone. Tested positive for COVID last Thursday, and we now have, I think it's 4 members of the House that have now tested positive for COVID, so that kind of sucks. So in terms of skills, let me just give you my career trajectory, actually, if that's helpful. I'm probably the least smart person in the room here. I wasn't a Penn undergrad. I went to the graduate school, studied engineering in London. I worked at a car company and went to consulting before doing my MBA at Wharton. I got into the energy space actually because I was randomly assigned to a case with an energy client. And for those of you that are thinking about a career in consulting, when you do that a second time around, as that has happened to me, I went to a second client. I became an expert in the energy space. But the best decision that I made, and I think this speaks a little bit to the skills question, is quitting the consulting gig a year after business school to help helped run a startup energy company. It was a company with no revenue at the time, no customers, and I helped to raise $50 million, grew it to $50 million in revenue with a couple hundred people. And I learned a lot in that time. It was probably the one time where I learned more at any point in my career. I learned the end-to-end of a business, learned how to make decisions quickly without perfect information, which is a real thing, because life is you're basically always without perfect information. I learned how to make a lot of mistakes, and I learned how to bounce back from them. So in the corporate world, we talk about resilience, and I think that's a really important part of the equation for anyone's career. I've been running divisions of energy companies ever since, across different parts of the value chain, and today, as Scott said, I run the National Grid in the United States, which is one of the larger investor-owned utilities in the U.S. In terms of skills specifically, there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of sort of general skills that you pick up through life around leadership. But in terms of energy specifically, this is I would say this is like an industrial sector. It can be highly engineering or tech, sort of highly technical. It's one that's changing rapidly. And I think it's also one that's heavily influenced by kind of politics, by legislation and regulation. So in that context, the skills that I think that have helped me is one, keeping things simple. I did have an engineering undergrad, but I never really used it as much as maybe I might otherwise have done. I think in this world, you find a lot of people who complexify things. Being able to keep it simple, strip out the noise, and simple communicating, I think makes a big difference. I think also in this context, because of the highly technical or engineering sort of culture, not being overly analytical. I think in this context, you'll find a lot of people who like to ask more and more questions, and that can lead to paralysis. And so you have to find a balance between moving, backing your instinct versus reason. And I think the last thing I'd say in this space specifically is that you have to be able to navigate the politics or the political reality in this world. It's can be heavily regulated. There's a lot of legislation, a lot of policy, and so being able to operate in, navigate, and influence legislation and regulation, I think makes a big difference. So Scott, let me just stop there before I keep on talking.
No,
to one of the others.
That's great, and don't feel bad about not using your engineering degree. I was a Russian studies major, never did anything with that either. So, Manu, you want to go next?
Yeah. Hey, Badar, good to see you. So, one of the things I have been blessed with in my career is fantastic bosses, one of whom was Badar for a decade. So it's good to see you. Wish we could have had dinner tonight, but hopefully next time. So just a little bit on my career, and just my journey, right? I was born in India, grew up in the Middle East, I grew up in a country called Oman, moved here to West Philadelphia for college, which, as you can imagine, was quite a shock to come here back in '91. I graduated and went to work as a trainee learning how to trade options. So I was a U.S. bond option trader for Swiss Bank Corp on the Chicago Board of Trade, and had really enjoyed it. And I made a move after a couple of years to Houston. And so the real story is I met my wife through mutual friends. She was living in Houston, and I moved to Houston to be with her. Found some folks that used to work at Swiss Bank that had moved over to the energy business, and that's how I got into the energy business. The company I worked for got bought by TXU. Had 12-year career with TXU, which has now been reincarnated as Vistra Corp. Started out as a trader, but I was chief risk officer, TXU Corp, and then ran their trading business, grew it from $100 million a year business to a $400 million a year business, and then helped sell the company. So we sold the company in 2008 to a private equity consortium led by KKR, TPG, and Goldman. Worked for the sponsor group for a year. At that point, I was 36. I had worked for one company for a third of my life, and it was time to do something different. And so left there, went to work for Badar at Direct Energy, ran their trading business, power generation, home services, retail energy, grew that business working together for 9 years, and got to the point where I did what I came to do. And so I left, took a year off, and then looked around and said, what do I want to do next? And decided to come to PJM because I see PJM as a grid operator and a markets operator right at the intersection of this energy transition. And I wanted to do something that made a difference societally, just beyond the walls of the company I work for. And so that's sort of my journey in a nutshell. In terms of skills, I wanted to share a story. So I've been really blessed. I've had unusual experiences. I was promoted to be an officer of this Fortune 500 company, TXU, when I was 24 or 25. And I didn't know the first thing about leading people. Didn't know anything about leading people. And I thought I absolutely was an expert. Absolutely was an expert. I was given this team of people, and I'd show up and try to be the smartest person in the room. And they're all looking at me like, why would we follow you? But anyways, I was completely oblivious to it. I had this nice office, wood paneling. I'd sit in it and sort of pontificate. And one day, one of my employees came into my office, right, and he shut the door. I figured here's another opportunity for me to demonstrate my expertise. And he said, hey, look, I want to talk to you about something. I said, sure, go ahead. And he said, I've been feeling kind of down lately. But I didn't have a template of what to do with that information. So I just was sort of quiet. And then he said, I have a gun. And I've been thinking of killing myself. And I didn't know what at all to do with that. But at this point, I was sort of thinking about, okay, this is a situation I haven't been in, but this is a person in need. And he came to me for something. And maybe that was the first moment I started to really be a leader. And I didn't actually do anything. I was just quiet there with him. I sort of stood up and gave him a hug, and we just sat for a while. And so there's a couple of lessons I'd share with you from that. One of them is I think that continuous learning is really important. Don't ever think that you know everything or that you've gotten there. I think the other lesson, though, is that leadership is about people. It's 100% about people. Management is about processes, it's about assets, it's about things, and it's important. Leadership is all about people. And as all of you grow and progress in your careers, as I know you will, try to remember that. I think it's one of the most powerful things that you can have. So in terms of skills, I certainly wasn't gifted with that one, but I did pick it up, and I'd share that with you.
Great. That's pretty powerful. Cherie, maybe a more uplifting anecdote?
I know that was very heavy.
Sorry.
Thank you for sharing that, though. I think you hit on something that I really do want to make sure I get out in terms of one of the skills that I find to be really impactful. And that's really thinking about the connection that you can have with people, right? There's nothing more important than human connection. And I think we saw it with the pandemic and being behind screens for so long. There's this thirst and desire to have the opportunity to see each other in person. And my career, so I'm a lobbyist, but I think in the news and media and how things can get spun around in terms of describing career roles, lobbyists can get a bad rap. I don't find my job to be controversial in any way. I think there are numerous organizations that have lobbyists. We are advocates. And in particular, I look at my role through the lens of being a change maker. And I say to myself, what's my purpose? What are the things that drive me? How can I make a difference every day? And so I think it's about finding your North Star and figuring out how you can leverage whatever role you're in, quite frankly, to be in a position of influence. You don't have to necessarily be in a designated leadership role to be influential and impactful. And so that's really what I've been able to get out of my career, is figuring out how to navigate some of society's darkest and most, deepest challenges, right? When we think about global climate change and the scale of action and innovation that it's going to take to really save our environment and our world, right? So that the future will be better for our children and grandchildren. And I think that companies essentially, in essence, can do well by doing good. So I've been at Delta Airlines for a year, and it's been quite a journey already. I am certainly enjoying all of the wonderful work that we're doing in that space, and climate change is central to the work that I do. Prior to joining Delta Airlines, I was with General Motors for about 5 years. And again, climate change, sustainability, equity, environmental equity, things of those nature were all elements of my role and ways in which I was able to advocate for policies that can enact some of these important decarbonization solutions that the other panelists are really leading on as well. I've also worked in a consulting firm. I was with MJ Bradley and Associates for a while, and part of that role, quite frankly, was about bringing strange bedfellows together. How do you get industry and environmental NGOs to work together and advocate for solutions hand in hand, or quietly, right? And strategize. And how do you really leverage, again, going back to the power of relationships? So that was an exciting time. Before that, I did trade association work. I was with the Electric Power Supply Association for a spin, Constellation Energy on the power side, and I worked on the House and the Senate side. I actually started right out of undergrad, following an internship that I had. I was in Congressman Al Wynn's office on the House side, and he was a member of the Energy and Commerce Committee. When I joined, I was literally thrown into a committee role. In essence, I served as a legislative assistant and a personal office, but he had been designated as a conferee on the Energy Policy Act of 2005, and I had to kind of figure out how to sink or swim. I think Penn gave me the skills to be able to navigate that, and I will, not belabor all of the kind of intricacies there, but I think each of these roles that I've had in my time at Penn have demonstrated to me that it is truly about the power of connection and just being able to make a difference through advocacy and human connection.
Great. And just as a follow-up to that, were there specific things vis-a-vis climate or energy while you were at Penn that sort of sent you in that direction, or was it really just happenstance because of the congressman you worked for, et cetera, et cetera?
It was happenstance. Interestingly, at one point, I think I was looking at bioethics. At another point, I was thinking about, international affairs and maybe being a diplomat. I did a Penn semester in Washington, which is a great program. If you guys haven't signed up for a semester in Washington and it's still something that is operational with COVID, I would highly recommend that. That did give me exposure to Capitol Hill. But the energy and environment work was really basically just being thrown into that role on Capitol Hill.
Well, we're glad it worked out that way. So Manu, maybe just from your perspective, carrying on with energy and climate, why is it so important for young people to want to go into a career in energy or climate-oriented fields?
Yeah, I'll go back to what Cherie said about purpose. And I think that's the other thing that is really important I've found in my career. The work is hard often, and whatever field you pick. If you're a hard charger, you're going to work hard. And for me personally, I find it's really important to work on something that I believe in the purpose of. I think energy, Scott, to your question, is for me that North Star. I think it's that purpose at this point in my life. And I really try to bring that purpose to my organization. I mean, if you think about where we are today, we were talking about this earlier. On one hand, you've got this existential crisis of climate change. We have to solve this as a people. On the other hand, you've got this crisis of energy security and affordability, and it's been made much worse by the what's happening in Ukraine at the moment. And so, how do you simultaneously solve climate change and also make sure that people who are vulnerable in our society actually have energy they can afford? I mean, go fill up your car at the pump. It's it's quite shocking. So I think energy is a great place to make a difference, and that's what I'd say.
Badr, you have anything to add to that?
Scott, you were saying 8 years ago, people maybe not have been focused on energy. 25 years ago, I don't think anybody was choosing, not a lot of people were choosing a career in energy. Today, we see, just enormous numbers of people putting their hand up saying we want to come work for, whether it's my company or other companies in the energy space, because of that purpose that both Manu and Cherie talked about. The focus on sustainability, climate change, I think is are drivers for so many young people coming into our space today. And I think it's a real thing, and it's one that's exciting, as Manu just shared.
Great. Well, look, I know this is a panel on just career paths, but each of your industries is in such transition right now. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about that for a minute. But maybe just touch on just some obvious, maybe others less obvious. We'll just go down the line and talk about, what are some of the big sea shifts going on in your industry now, particularly around energy and climate, that I think folks would be interested in. Cherie, you want to start?
Sure. So one of the issues that has been kind of front and center for me since joining Delta is really thinking about what are the solutions for the aviation sector, which is inherently hard to decarbonize. 98% of our greenhouse gas emissions are from fossil jet fuel. And so we need to be able to address that. What does that require? That requires the creation of an entirely new industry, quite frankly. We are working on solutions to bring sustainable aviation fuel to scale. Right now, the size of the sustainable aviation fuel market is only sufficiently large enough to power 1 day of Delta's pre-COVID flying. So that just gives you a sense of the scale that we need to tackle here. Additionally, you're looking at changing entrenched industries. If you think about this, we need the fossil fuel industry to begin to break into these kind of cleaner fuels or biofuels, next-gen fuels, et cetera. But to do that, there's going to have to be a willingness for different stakeholders, oftentimes with competing interests, to work together. And to me, that has been most interesting because I will use the excuse of being new to kind of push people to think a little bit differently out of the box. In my view, we essentially need all of the stakeholders to be at the table, right? This is a situation where we are looking to resolve access to a market that has traditionally been dominated by on-road fuel solutions. And so I think at this stage, we need the existing infrastructure, the existing refineries, for example, to think creatively about co-processing. We also need new entrants to the market who are going to be solely dedicated to sustainable aviation fuel. But to get there, we need government incentives and critical funding, quite frankly. So I've been working really to leverage policy solutions in this space. We're largely advocating for tax credits that will be sufficiently large enough and over a duration that's long enough to drive the market forward and send the right market signals to investors and potential entrants in this space. So that it's certainly one of those areas where I think we're going to be working on this for quite some time. But as we've seen with the IPCC report, we have to move expeditiously.
Manu, you want to answer the same question?
Yeah, it's the same dilemma from just a different angle. On one hand, the electricity market in PJM has been decarbonizing for 15 years. And we've dropped our carbon emissions intensity by a third in the last 15 years. And that's been because of the discovery of shale gas in Pennsylvania and Ohio. So we've had gas generation rise, coal generation fall into the background. And that's just accelerating. And if you think about PJM, we serve 1 in 5 Americans. About 20% of the US economy is connected to our grid. And so it's really important to get this right. 13 states, District of Columbia, each state, each jurisdiction is running and is dictating their own energy policy. And they all have slightly different energy policies. So our dilemma is, how do you create a market that facilitates all of those energy policies, but does it in a way that's reliable and in a way that's affordable? That's sort of, in a nutshell, what we're working on. It's a really exciting time to be in this space.
Great. Badr?
Yeah, look, utilities are in a really interesting place because, we're supplying power and gas to, millions of people across the country. When I think about the challenge that's ahead, it is all about this transition. How do you run a business that has to be there on time 99.999% of the time? People want their power increasingly today because everyone's working and studying from home, or has been for the last couple of years. But we also want this transition to take place. I don't think I've ever used the word urgency and it'll take 30 years in the same sentence. It's a really interesting thing. We're not going to flip a switch. It's not going to happen overnight, but we have to make progress, with the level of urgency. And when I think about this transition, certainly in the world that, as we think about it, in terms of society-wide emissions reduction, we see emissions reduction across 3 areas. So decarbonizing electricity supply, it's about 20% of society-wide emissions. And it's renewables, onshore wind, onshore solar, investments in the grid to connect all of that new renewable capacity, offshore wind, huge resource potential off the east coast of the United States, being able to build it, finance it, build it, and then bring it back onto the mainland. There are tons and tons of questions and challenges there. Storing energy to accommodate intermittent energy. That's one area. 40% of society-wide emissions is transport. And so, that's, largely electrifying vehicles. Huge area of opportunity and shift. Again, how do you build the charging for us? How do you build the charging infrastructure so that you actually have vehicles that can get charged and you're dealing with range anxiety? How do you develop a system that can send power back to the grid from your batteries in your vehicles? Two-way power flows, lots of really unique and interesting challenges. And then 40% of society-wide emissions is heating, which is particularly difficult in cold climate, states that in the Northeast United States, which is where our customers are. Unlike electricity supply and transportation, alternatives to fossil fuel do exist, and they're increasingly more, affordable and at parity with fossil generation and fossil alternatives. For heating, that's not the case. 5 million buildings in the Northeast are still heated with oil. We got to get off oil. But being able to, a lot of people talk about electrifying buildings. 40% of buildings are hard to electrify. The winter heating peak is 3 times the cooling peak in the summer. And so if you wanted to replace all the heat that comes from natural gas with electricity, you'd have to, again, build significant infrastructure to accommodate all that. So there's lots of challenges. And we see solutions that range from energy efficiency, electrification, but also renewable natural gas and hydrogen actually over the long term. So really interesting, I think, challenges across the 3 sectors that we look at for society-wide emissions reduction. think the other issues in there, though, are equity. Cherie talked about equity. I think that's hugely important, making sure it's not just the Tesla drivers that are benefiting from clean air, for example, how the role of consumers playing a role in changing the way that we do things on a regular basis, I think is going to be hugely important, and the role of entrepreneurs and technology in disrupting the system that exists today. So those are some of the things that we look at, Scott.
Great, and this is a really good segue into the next question I wanted to focus on. We have a room full of students here who presumably are thinking about, okay, where are they going to get a job when they graduate? And many or most people are here because they're thinking about the energy transition, about decarbonization. In an earlier session I was in, there was a question around, so if I want to participate in this, do I need to go to some sort of startup or something, some company that has some whiz bang new product in the energy transition? I think, as we've all been talking about, right, that's an interesting, important part of the whole decarbonization and energy transition, but the amount of dollars that have to be spent, the amount of that the economy has to move is so much more heavily focused on existing industry. So as you think about your industries and think about the challenges you're facing, kind of specifically, where do you see the most need for expertise or jobs or things that folks can think about? If they wanted to participate in this, what's next? Where do they come? I don't know, Manu, you want to kick that one off?
Sure, yeah. A few areas. I think for us, transmission engineering is a critical skill as we rebuild out the infrastructure. I think data science is another critical skill. If you think about the amount of data that we're collecting off the grid, we're putting sensors, hundreds of sensors on our grid that are collecting sub-second data. So we're getting data multiple times a second about the status of different parts of our grid. Well, no human being in our control center can actually process data at that pace. So if you think about 10, 15 years from now, are you going to have human beings controlling these systems? Are they going to be autonomous? How do you participate in making those autonomous? Engineering, data science, AI is going to be absolutely critical for us. And then the other thing I'd say is just people skills. We run a stakeholder process. I have over 1,000 members at PJM, and each of them thinks they're my boss, which is an interesting dynamic. But each of them has something valuable to contribute to the stakeholder process. And we try to create these market rules through the stakeholder process, through getting input from a whole bunch of intelligent, expert, self-interested parties that are helping us design the future. And we're the independent body that actually comes up at the end of the day and tries to pull all of that together and present a proposal to our regulator, FERC. And so that takes a pretty unique skill set. And I think that skill set of people skills, being able to build consensus and work with others to try to solve complex problems that don't have a point solution, that's not a mathematical solution. Any solution is going to be a compromise. So how do you come to a sustainable compromise as opposed to get stuck in people in their own camps fighting with each other and we're not moving forward? I think that's a critical skill that I would hire right now.
Cherie?
Well, I want to steal everything that you said. I do. I think that all of those points are exactly right. On the technical side, we certainly need engineers and analysts, folks that can figure out some of these breakthrough technological solutions, right? We need innovation at scale. We need folks that are willing to research in the labs, who are willing to take small ideas and try to run them through the entire research development demonstration project. Within corporations as well, I think that there's also opportunity to really influence that policy development process, right? What I'm hearing consistently is that there's this theme that these solutions all require some type of policy intervention. And so it really does help when you have those soft skills necessary to analyze problems and think about tactical solutions. What are the strategic groups that you can bring together? What are ways that you can present your issue in a way that anyone can understand? So not getting too deep into the weeds. And I think that is one of the challenges that we oftentimes have when we are overly technical. And that can be one of the things that's kind of off-putting about the energy and environment sector, is that it's very easy to get into very technical, nuanced discussions. And so how do you take that to a higher frame of reference and make it accessible to everyone so that they can feel that they're a part of that energy system and that they're making a difference? And I think those skills will really be useful as you're presenting to potential employers.
Badr, you have anything
to add? Really, I mean, look, there's, we have 17,000 people in our company, and we invest $4-5 billion a year in our infrastructure, power and gas infrastructure. What we've been doing over the last couple of years is our capital, that organic capital plan that we do every year. We try and understand. We're mapping our investment to emissions reduction. So how much of that $4 or $5 billion is actually contributing to or enabling emissions reduction, whether it's modernizing the grid, whether it's all this technology to allow us to interconnect more renewables, infrastructure for charging vehicles, how we're rethinking our capital plan for resilience, RD&D. We don't typically do a lot of RD&D, but over the next decade, I see a significant amount of RD&D into things like hydrogen production, long duration storage. More and more of our people in their day-to-day jobs, as opposed to some side project, are fully engaged in this energy transition. So I think you were asking, do you have to go work for a little startup? I think, yeah, you can work for a little startup, but I think the large businesses are fully engaged in this energy transition. We're doing financing, issuing green bonds that investors are subscribing to because of the work that we're doing for this energy transition. So I think there are a huge number of opportunities for young people to be involved in the energy transition today, as well as in startups.
Yeah, and that's really the point I wanted to get across with this question. I mean, every industry you can think of is going to be involved in the decarbonization of the economy over the next 30 years. I mean, I just saw, we're sitting here in this School of Design. I saw a study last week. The world is going to spend $1 trillion building seawalls over the next 30 years, right? I mean, the Dutch will be employed forever, doing that. We haven't spent 1/100th of that in the last 100 years. Every industry from cement to steel to auto to every industry is going to need the best and brightest figuring out how are they getting here, because any company you can think of has made a 2030, 2040, or 2050 carbon neutrality commitment and probably has no idea sitting here today exactly how they're going to get there. They're banking on smart people joining the company, figuring this out, over time. So you're going to find opportunities to participate in the energy transition in everywhere you turn. So I think that's just, it's failure of imagination not to think about where this could be applicable.
That seawall example is pretty depressing, I have to say.
It's crazy. It's crazy. And that's okay, because it's coming, right? Energy transition is going to save, these guys' kids, right? But water's coming. Water's coming. Yeah. So I think it was Badr who mentioned, the equitable access to the energy transition. I know, Cherie, this is something you spend a lot of time personally on. Just for those who don't know, can you just give a brief definition, as we think about what does equitable access to the energy transition mean, and how are companies thinking about this? How are they addressing it?
Sure. So I think what's really interesting about this is that when you think about those individuals that are disproportionately impacted by pollution, or who bear the largest cost associated with access to energy, they tend to be those that have been most historically marginalized. And so what I think companies are starting to do is really think about what are ways that we can leverage access to clean energy resources, right, which are going to have enormous public health benefits to these communities that have been disproportionately burdened by fossil pollution, quite frankly. And there's a real intentionality, I will say, that I think is happening. When I was at General Motors, one of the things that we worked on and that I was really proud to spearhead was an internal process to develop a set of equity principles that was really reflective of what it means to be an automaker and acknowledge the contributions that, let's think about highways and byways and how they've divided urban cities and the mechanics of manufacturing plants and urban towns and urban areas. I think there's an acknowledgement that, okay, well, now that we're shifting from internal combustion engine to electric vehicles, how do we make sure that, to the point that was made earlier about not only having access to Tesla, not only being only the wealthy having access to Tesla, how do we make sure that electric vehicles are affordable to all? Are there opportunities to think about subsidizing the cost, about thinking strategically with respect to ride sharing? We think about mobility solutions and things of that nature. So I think there's just a deeper desire for companies to understand the communities in which they live and serve, and to be more intentional about their approach to policy and the ways in which they are advancing this clean energy revolution, if you will.
Great.
Scott, can I just to provide a couple of very quick specific examples, and that just builds on what Cherie was saying. So in transport electrification, not only does not everybody have access to a car, a lot of people don't have access to their own private driveway. They live in apartment buildings. And so, electrifying buses, electrifying school buses is part of the solution. Making sure that charging infrastructure is in publicly accessible locations is a huge part of the journey. So when we look at our charging infrastructure we're deploying in our states, 70% of it is in publicly accessible locations, not just private driveways. 50% are environmental justice communities. And those are specific things that can be done. We provide $500 million of incentives in our states to customers to take advantage of energy efficiency, incentives to weatherize their homes or do insulation or what have you. The vast majority of that goes to people who own their own homes. The reality is, disproportionately Black and brown communities don't own their own homes. They rent their homes, and as a result, they don't take access. They don't participate in all the energy efficiency funding that we provide. And those are things that can be done, that we can, with active thought, intentional thought, you can do something about and address this issue of equity. And actually, in that example of the kind of the problems of home ownership in the United States.
Great, really helpful to think about. It's not something you would instinctively think about, so really important to keep top of mind. So maybe just to, last question before we open it up to Q&A. It might be a little redundant, but any last pieces of advice, you'd offer students who want to come enter, your industry, anything, keep top of mind for them. Maybe, Badr, you can keep going.
Yeah, look, I think that I remember what it was like being at school, and there was a lot of focus on, what job you're going to get when you come out. And, hopefully you've got a sense from this discussion and maybe many other discussions that your first job out of school is not going to be your last job. It's really just the beginning. And so I think that, just think about it in that context, that there's a lot of pressure I think people put on themselves about landing their first job. And frankly, I don't think that should exist. what I would say, this isn't necessarily specific to energy, but just in life, enjoy what you're doing. If you enjoy what you do, you're probably going to be better at it than if you didn't enjoy what you do. And I think you've heard already a couple of times, make sure you're learning. When you're no longer learning, when you sort of run out, it's time to think about the next thing to do. And I guess the last thing I'd say is take risk early. Chances are earlier in your career, in your life, you're going to be able to take risk. You may not have a mortgage or a family, you may not be supporting people. And so that's the time where you can take a lot of risk. And you should do that, and particularly in areas where you think you're going to learn the most.
Great. Manu?
Yeah, so I have a practical piece of advice. PJM has offered our employees a ton of flexibility. So our control room operators have to go into the office. No one else actually has to go into the office. It's sort of completely flexible as long as you get the job done. But my advice to you is go into the office, go on site. The amount that you learn from interacting with people who have done it before is not replaceable on Zoom or WebEx or Teams. So that's one piece of advice. The other piece of advice is when you do go into the office, you select where you're going to go from the range of choices you have based on who you're going to learn from. The first few jobs are all about growing yourself and learning and gathering skills. So, pick who you want to learn from and then get as physically close to them and stay there to absorb all that you can.
Great advice as well. Cherie?
So I think I have, 2 or so reflections that I'll just share with you all. One, when I was at Penn, I remember all of the Wharton students. They were all going to investment banking, summer internships, or going to Goldman Sachs after graduation. And that, to me, was like, well, wait, what am I doing wrong? Right? Like, why am I going to work a government job that pays like $30,000 or less, like for a first-year role? But I think the point is that don't compare yourself to your colleagues. Compare yourself to yourself. You are competing with yourself. You need to be the best version of you. And so focus on what brings you joy. Focus on those larger questions that you want to resolve. And that leads into my kind of second piece of advice, which is wherever you end up, think about establishing a personal board of directors, right? Corporations all have boards of directors and, rely on these external trusted advisors to steer them in the right direction. Well, why shouldn't you? So think about those people that are in roles that you admire or where you want to be, and be curious and ask questions. You would be so surprised how much people just want to talk to you. So that's my advice.
All actually really, really good advice. Thank you, guys.
Scott, what's your advice for?
Yeah. Look, the thing that's always gotten me through things, and I would say has helped me select who is really going to be, the survivors and the keepers. Keep your head down, work hard, low drama, right? The squeaky wheel does not get the oil. And if you kind of do that, stay intellectually curious, and have that perseverance to keep grinding, you're all really, really smart people. Good things generally come from that. And that's been kind of my personal mantra, and it generally works.
I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but you've had an amazing career, so I was really curious.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's thanks. Yeah, low drama. Remember, low drama. Yeah. Great. Well, look, it's been great for us to sit and chat for a while, but we'd love to answer any questions you have on careers or just the sector in general, or anything that's of interest. So, please go ahead.
I have a question for all the panelists.
Hang on one second, Mike's coming. Yeah.
My name is Santam, and I'm in the School of Engineering pursuing a master's in materials science. So my question is kind of like, so you have this energy transition where we're moving away from fossil fuels, right? And you have a lot of people who'd get left behind because they'll have skills which are not really useful anymore, right? When you're moving away from IC engines, then the people who are working on IC engines don't really have a useful skill anymore. And the fossil fuel industry is like one of the largest industries in the world. So how do we take care of like policy and re-education or like reskilling of people in this transition? Anybody? It's to all three panelists.
Does anyone want to start?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge issue for us. You know, about half our business is gas. We supply natural gas. And so I get that question from half my workforce every single day. What's going to happen to my job? And, you know, the way we think about it is, you know, the transition's not going to happen overnight. This isn't a flip the switch thing. There's going to be, you know, decades of time for people to reinvest in their skills. You know, in my space in particular, I don't think the infrastructure is going to go away. In fact, we're going to need more infrastructure. And so the skill sets of building, project financing, building, project managing, operating infrastructure is still going to be there. It's going to be a different commodity that flows through that infrastructure. And when we talk about it like that with our people, particularly in our workforce that's gas, we think about the potential for things like hydrogen and renewable natural gas, network geothermal. I think, you know, people start to look at the question differently and with a bit more, you know, with just sort of less superficiality than I think might initially be present.
The only thing I'd add is, you know, there's certainly that repurposing of skills to work on the same assets from a different angle that Badar talked about. There's also just an honest conversation to be had, right? We are in a place where we're trying to effectuate this transition and simultaneously trying to get our oil and gas industry to drill more. That is the official message to the industry. And so you need to have that honest conversation with people because we're also sending the message. The markets are sending the message. Policymakers are sending the message. Hey, we need you to keep doing what you're doing. And so I'd say it's actually an unsolved problem. And I challenge all of you to think about how are you going to solve that problem. That's a great question.
Yeah, I think what I would add there too is that from a public policy lens, there's a lot that the government is going to have to do. I know when there were discussions about implementing cap and trade legislation or carbon tax legislation, there's been, you know, always there was a question of how do you ensure that there are funds that are going to be dedicated to ensuring that there is a just transition for those individuals that are now going to have to shift their modes of work. And so kind of thinking about ways to invest in opportunities for training and thinking about leveraging existing programs at universities such as Penn, maybe even the Energy Center here, to think about those solutions, I think are critically important, and then the government will have to help. Additionally, companies are also doing this on their own as well. They're thinking about taking those transferable skills just to apply them to the new technologies that are under development. So it's going to be a public-private kind of partnership solution ultimately at the end of the day.
All these things are true. I mean, the biggest impediment to the end state is how do you make sure the population comes along, you know, with it. And so it is probably one of the biggest questions we're going to have to solve, you know, in the next 20 years. Eventually, right, I mean, your kids or your kids' kids will just be working in those fields, but how you bring, you know, folks over the next 20 or 30 years along is really the big question we have to solve. Please.
Thank you all so much for this wonderful panel. I am a first-year graduate student at UPenn studying environmental studies and focus on energy transition. And one big dilemma that I have been facing, which is privileged to be facing, is that I found that not only the energy industry, but also agriculture and aviation, which UPenn, the diverse interdisciplinary courses has exposed me to, are also facing a lot of challenges. So when I come to consuming information to try to keep up with what's going on in the industry, there are geopolitics going on, there are industry news, there are the policy, there are technology changes, and I found it's overwhelming to keep up with everything. So I wonder what is your advice to be more well-versed in your in your industry, but also to keep on a side on other industry, what's going on with there. So what's your strategy and recommendation? Thank you.
Well, I guess I'll just jump in there because in my job, I feel like I have to constantly digest information, and it is overwhelming. I will say what I try to do is sign up for news alerts from trusted resources. So like there's Politico, they I think acquired E&E Daily, but it's still branded that way. And that's energy and environment news. And so there's Climate Wire, I think that's also under that same umbrella. And they have daily updates constantly of what's going on. And so just taking a few minutes at the top of the morning to go through that. I think podcasts are also really good resources. You can find a few that you like. I found just searching for like sustainable aviation fuel or energy, climate, will just pull up a host of things. I think BlackRock, for example, does one as well.
The Kleinman
It's really
Center.
timely. The Kleinman Center. But yeah, those are just a few ideas.
Yeah, I think the reality is this particular sector is undergoing massive change every day, every week, every year. And so there's really not a lot you can do about it other than trying to just find those trusted sources that you think are relevant and keep digesting.
One thing I'd add is,
Can I just-
oh, sorry, go ahead, Bader.
The only thing I was going to say is you could spend all day reading. I mean, there's just so much that's out there. Cherie talked about just a sample, and you should absorb what's going on as much as you can, but you should also try and make sure that you're spending some time actually executing, participating in the transition, working on some projects. I couldn't quite catch when the person had asked the question if she's at the end of her time at Penn or the beginning of her time, but certainly if you're at the end of your time, get a job and work in the sector and work on some really exciting projects, and you'll absorb a ton in that way.
I don't know where you're going to.
Yeah, no,
Great.
That's great.
Great.
That's great advice.
Please, just hang on for the mic.
Thank you so much for sharing. I guess I had an industry-related question, and it's been mentioned that public policy and regulation is a big part of this industry. So with regards to longer-term initiatives towards the energy transition, with changes in administration, does that reflect on these initiatives? Are they obstacles? Is it very stop and go with regards to who's in Capitol Hill, or is there a way to, I guess, maintain consistency and progress towards this transition?
I'd say it's a mix. It's a mix. I think so. If you look at tax credits for renewable generation, they've been remarkably consistent, with ups and downs. If you look at state policies, they do vary. So, Virginia is a state that is in PJM, and Virginia just had an election, and they had a switch in party. And so the new governor is exploring ways to extract Virginia from the regional greenhouse gas initiative, where the previous administration was looking for sort of ways to move further in that direction. So, elections have consequences, and particularly in a place where so much of the climate policy is being driven on a state-by-state basis, that's an important aspect that that can and does change.
I think.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Cherie.
I think what's also interesting there is when you think about the global nature of the energy transition, and you look at the last administration and the decision to pull out of the UN negotiating process. And now you have a new administration who has re-entered and has essentially said that climate change is something that's going to take a whole of government approach that is starkly different. However, Companies, I think, given their long-term view, of course they prefer regulatory certainty and having a sense of what is to come, but I think they kind of build in for those types of changes and they try to be nimble. So what I would say is kind of watch what companies do on that 4-year cycle as well, and what types of and long-term investments are they making, recognizing that there's so many changes happening at the state and federal level. But it does create a little bit of uncertainty. I think it's up to businesses to ensure that they are also consistently messaging along the lines of what it is that they want to see with either party in power. And that is an important role for businesses to play.
I would actually go one step further. I actually think maybe at a state or micro level, things actually do affect you on a day-to-day. But companies are investing because they see where the puck is going, right? Delta Airlines, I don't really know anything about it, but they're focused on sustainable fuels, not because there's a government regulation telling them they need to, but because they don't want to wake up and find out that American Airlines has done this and people don't want to fly on Delta because they want to fly on a sustainable airline, right? That's what's driving this. It's really government regulation largely lags, I think, on this issue where the puck is going, and companies, certainly forward foot thinking companies are getting way ahead of it. But
yeah. Can I just add, I was at Glasgow this year or last year at COP26. My company was one of the handful of principal sponsors of the whole thing. There are 50,000 people there, and I can't tell you how. I kind of went to there unsure about the whole thing. Is it really gonna do anything? And I came out significantly more optimistic, and I was optimistic because of the presence of CEOs and finance executives, which I think was just not seen before in any of the prior COPs. Every second person I bumped into was someone that was saying that this was their first COP, and they were a CEO of a company or a finance, financing something. That's an execution orientation. That tells me that people are serious, and they're serious about executing. There was a ministerial conversation going on that the rest of the world was reporting on. But while I was there and the other 50,000 people, no one was focusing on that. That was like a sideshow. What was the action was business being present and executing, and it was pretty exciting, actually.
Great. Well, I think we're actually out of time. So thank you to our panelists, and thank you for all coming here. We can give everyone a round of applause. I believe we have a happy hour reception right in the lobby downstairs. And the last thing I was asked to say is please look at your Energy Week cards and see if there are other events you want to hit later in the week. So thank you all for coming. Thank you.